They arrived at the ruins when the sun was already setting. Iga stayed late on purpose and brought friends here closer to dusk to enhance the effect and prove to Tanya that this place is much more mysterious and scary than the abandoned school she insisted on. Iga was running a YouTube channel with the beautiful name Anomaly, and together with a small team of like-minded people, he searched the abandoned buildings in search of these very anomalies. But the main trick was not only in exciting reviews of former mental hospitals, cemeteries, hospitals, schools and so on. His girlfriend Tatiana had a wild imagination and easily cooked up horror stories about ghosts, the dead, murderers and other terrible inhabitants of our world and the other world. Reviews of abandoned buildings, coupled with scary stories written about these very places, were a success. The channel quickly gained popularity, gained a large number of subscribers, and the team of stalker bloggers was looking for new interesting and creepy buildings with even greater diligence. Usually disagreements between friends rarely arose, but today Tanya was stubborn. Halloween was approaching and she already had a plot ready on this topic. It was only necessary to find a suitable abandonment, and Tanya found an old school. And Iga came across photos of a creepy monastery on the internet, caught fire with this idea, and encouraged the team to go to the ruins. At first, Tanya grumbled that the idea of the monastery was so-so, and she didn't have a single thought in her head about it at all, but when she arrived at the place, she changed her mind. In the rays of the setting sun, the ruins looked majestic and creepy at the same time. The former monastery was located far enough from the nearest settlement, and it was clear that curious noses did not particularly stick here. The yard was overgrown with tall weeds, and there were no traces of civilization like empty cans, bottles, wrappers and other garbage. Dennis pulled out the necessary accessories from the trunk, and the small company headed to the entrance. Inside, the monastery was just as gloomy and inhospitable. Grey, moss-covered walls sadly propped up the dilapidated arches. It's strange, because it would seem to be a holy, prayed-for place, but I want to leave it as soon as possible. Alessia screamed when suddenly a bat flew right in front of her, disturbed by loud voices. Apparently owls and bats were now the absolute masters of this sad temple. The only thing pleasing to the eye was the young grass stubbornly making its way through piles of stones. Life and death, as always, went hand in hand. The dreary, cramped cells where people who had linked their way with God lived a long time ago looked at the unexpected guests with empty eye sockets of broken windows. Even during the prosperity of the monastery, it was not easy to live here. And why torture yourself like that? Is it really impossible to serve God without bodily tortures? Who even said he needed this sacrifice? Tanya mused, standing in one dilapidated cell. Iga and Dennis were tuning up the equipment, cheerfully calling to Alessia. Tanya took several pictures, which, in her opinion, are quite suitable for illustrating the story. What exactly she will write about this time, the girl has not yet decided. Lost in thought, she went to the small window of the cell and took another picture, but almost dropped the phone. Pointing the camera at the window, Tanya saw on the screen the silhouette of a girl hanging in the air, or rather a hanged girl. Tanya couldn't hold back the scream, and naturally friends immediately rushed over. When Iga found out what had happened, he was overjoyed. I told you I had to come here. Now let's make a great release, everyone will squeal with delight. But where did the ghost go? Hey, where are you? Alessia showed with her eyes. From behind. And turning around, the friends saw a girl in antique clothes. Her long hair fell over her shoulders. In the gathering dusk, the white dress stood out as a bright spot. The face was also as white as paper, and therefore probably the eyes seemed unnaturally dark and creepy, like two bottomless wells. But the most terrible thing was that there was a piece of rope hanging around the girl's neck. For a minute everyone froze in a daze, silently looking at the stranger. The ghost, meanwhile, beckoned them with his hand and floated through the air, heading deep into the ruins. Iga was the first to recover and nudged Dennis, whispering softly, "Take it off faster." He nodded, turning on the camera. However, no one dared to go after the deceased until the girl called them again, making signs with her hands and shaking her head impatiently. Iga gathered his courage first. After all, he brought friends here, and it was a shame to celebrate a coward. He followed the ghost, and the others followed him in single file. The ghost led them further and further until it stopped at a dead end near a stone wall. There was no further progress. The girl pointed her finger at the wall and disappeared through it. It was obvious that the deceased wanted to show them something, but where did she go? Dennis shone his flashlight, but found no door, no window, and no other manhole. The wall was absolutely smooth. Strange, Tanya whispered, but then slapped her forehead. Of course. There must be some kind of lever opening the door. It's a secret passage. She snatched the flashlight from Dennis's hands and began to carefully examine the surface. Most likely it's a wall candlestick. Tanya grabbed him, tried to turn in different directions, and she succeeded. A gap formed in the wall. The girl pressed harder, and the well-camouflaged door opened. Behind the door there was a staircase leading down somewhere, apparently to the basement. Shall we go? Tanya asked hesitantly. The friends nodded silently in response. It was scary to go, but curiosity overcame. What if they find the treasure there? Gold or something like that? Slowly, one by one, the friends descended into the dungeon of the monastery. No. There was no gold there. A terrible find was waiting for them in one of the gloomy, damp rooms of the huge basement. There lay a female skeleton in decayed clothes. The girls screamed, clinging to each other. Iger and Dennis also could not resist the frightened exclamations. Damn it. What's it? A quiet voice behind them made the friends almost jump on the spot in horror. The girl who brought them here was standing in the doorway of the room and pointing at the skeleton, spoke. Don't be afraid of me. I will not harm you, on the contrary. I am very grateful. Now the cursed monk has lost his power over me. Seeing our bewilderment, she sighed. I will tell you my sad story. My name was Maria. I was born and raised in a rich merchant family. My father was a cheerful, generous man. On holidays, the house is full of guests, festivities, songs, gypsies. He spoiled me mercilessly. The best dresses, governesses. Yes, so as not to be brought up worse than a noblewoman. And my mother, on the contrary, was a modest, very pious and strict woman. From an early age, I went with her to churches and monasteries. My mother tried in every possible way to pacify pride, gave a lot of money to churches, and especially fell in love with this monastery. The abbot in it was Father John, who was famous for his ruthless rigor and piety. He drove the monks almost to exhaustion. Constant prayers, poor food, hard work, cold cells. A gloomy, dreary place, more like a penal servitude. It seemed to me that the abbot just likes to torment people, and I was not mistaken. But for some reason, my mother liked to come here during Lent. She worshipped Father John, considering him almost a saint. When I grew up, my mother began to bring me to purify my soul. Those were the hardest days of my life. Pampered by my father, I am not used to coarse food, to thin blankets that do not protect from the cold. And Father John filled me with indescribable horror. Especially his strange look, as if groping me from head to toe. Even from afar, without turning around, I felt this look on my skin and tried to disappear somewhere. Thank God that my mother rarely came here. The last fateful visit took place before my engagement. A young merchant wooed me. Our fathers were friends and were happy to marry the children and to combine the capitals. The groom was not stupid, he was good-looking and good-natured. On the eve of the betrothal, it occurred to my mother to send me to a monastery in order to receive the blessing of Father John. No matter how I tried to persuade her to go after the wedding, her mother would not agree. My heart was squeezed by a bad premonition, but I did not dare to contradict her will and went to the monastery. My mother, because of a severe migraine, could not go with me. I arrived there in the evening, went to my cell, prayed and put on a thin monastic shirt, and lay down in a hard bed, shivering from cold and fear. A miserable candle stub illuminated the cell with a dim light. For some reason, the faces of the saints seemed unnaturally alive and creepy to me. An owl screamed outside the window. My heart suddenly started beating so loudly and so fast, as if it wanted to jump out of my chest. I made the sign of the cross over myself and approached the image. Then footsteps were heard in the corridor. Someone stopped at the door of my cell, stood for a minute as if thinking, and the door opened. It was the abbot. I looked at him with fright and bewilderment. What does he need at this hour? He came up, breathing heavily and not taking his creepy gaze off me. I was petrified with fear. He muttered something, holding out his hands to me. I came to my senses and wanted to run out of the cell, but he stood in the way. And then the worst thing happened. The girl lowered her head and was silent for a few seconds, gathering her strength. Then, with a great effort of will, she forced herself to continue. The abbot grabbed me, put his hand over my mouth and threw me on the bed. Trembling with terror, I tried to resist, but my strength was quickly draining away. He squeezed me so that my breath was taken away, and then a monstrous pain pierced my body. There are no more forces left. In the end, a saving swoon enveloped me in its dark veil. I woke up before dawn, at first not even realizing where I was. My head felt like it was on fire. I didn't know how much time had passed in unconsciousness. But suddenly I remembered the terrible misfortune that happened to me and got up, overcoming weakness and pain. We need to escape from the robbers' lair as soon as possible. I was frantically pulling on my clothes when the door opened again and my tormentor appeared. I cowered in fear and huddled in a corner, trembling and crying. He came closer, grabbed me by the chin and forced me to look into his eyes. And when he started talking, I realized that the abuse of my body is not the worst thing that happened today. Every word of the scoundrel echoed in the soul with a death knell. I fell into a trap from which there was no way out. I hope, Maria, you understand that after today's event you will not return home again. Event, that's what he called his crime. Meanwhile, the executioner continued, not paying attention to my condition. There will be no wedding, of course. You're pious, he emphasized this word, grinning nastily. Mother will be horrified and indignant when she finds out that her daughter has sinned with one of our monks, whom I will, of course, roughly punish for sin. To avoid disgrace, you will be sent to a convent. The future fate is in your own hands. The abbess of the monastery that I will recommend to your parents is a loyal person. If you submit to me, I will pick you up and take you to my estate, located not very far from here. You will live in prosperity, you will not need anything. And I will visit you often. If you resist, you will rot in the monastery. The conditions there are unsuitable for a young lady, and the Mother Superior especially favors libertines. So choose. Either live with me or die. The scoundrel came out of the cell, and in despair, I fell on my knees in front of the icon, and began to pray fervently that the Lord would save me from such a terrible fate. Was I a great sinner? Did she deserve such a punishment? Pictures of the future appeared before my eyes, one more terrible than the other. No one will believe me. What does my word mean against the abbot of the monastery, who has great power? ! No one can save me. I'm dead. He said there were only two ways, but he was wrong. There is a third way. Think about it. Don't ruin your soul. God does not send a person a test that he is unable to endure, his mind kept saying, but his heart suggested something else. I will not endure these tortures and humiliations. I am afraid of a painful, slow death. It's better to end this once. I quickly tore the sheet, made a rope, pulled a stool to the window and stood on it. The first cock crowed. Now the monastery will wake up. It's time. I put the rope around my neck and took a step forward. Everyone listened to the deceased with horror and pity at the same time. Alessia and Tanya were crying. The girl was silent for another minute. It was obvious that these memories were very hard for her. When the scoundrel discovered my body, he hid it in the basement, hiding the traces of the crime, and told his parents that I had escaped from the monastery at night. It did not even occur to anyone to suspect the pious abbot of kidnapping or other crime. They searched for me for many years, but they never found me. It was a heavy blow for my parents. 5 years later, my father died of anguish, and my mother ended her days in an almshouse. After her father's death, she distributed her entire fortune to churches and orphanages, and went to the poorest monastery to live out her life in tears and prayers. So, the crime was hidden from human eyes, but not from God. When the death hour of Father John came, the monks who entered the cell froze with fear. The abbot was lying on the floor, clutching himself by the throat with both hands. His eyes were wide open, his mouth was distorted. All the icons and crosses were thrown to the floor. On many icons, the saints had no eyes. Someone was poking at the canvases with a knife with great fury. Even the wooden icons were striated lengthwise and across. People later said that he sold his soul to Satan. And so it was. We are both not at rest. The executioner and the victim. And after death, he tormented me for many years, but he no longer has power over my soul or body. Finally I will find peace. The ashes of the unfortunate Maria were buried in an ancient cemetery next to her parents. Iger managed to unearth information about the mysterious disappearance in 1829 of the daughter of the merchant of the First Guild Ivan Polozov. The secret of the old monastery was revealed.